Welcome to the debate. We are biologically wired to show off our success.
Oh, absolutely. It's human nature.
Right, because for thousands of years, survival meant displaying resources, right? You needed the biggest fire, the most elaborate dwelling, just the clearest outward signals that you were thriving.
It signaled safety and status. Yeah.
Exactly. So what happens when you deliberately choose to swim against thousands of years of evolution and make your wealth entirely invisible? Today, we're examining the concept of frugality in the modern era. And just to be clear, we are putting aside the concept of mere cheapness.
Good, because that's a whole different ballgame.
Completely different. We're focusing on extreme resource optimization as a profound mental model for lifestyle design. So the central question we are exploring today is this: is frugality the ultimate strategic engine for personal sovereignty, autonomy, and freedom?
Or does it impose hidden creativity taxes, structural rigidities, and severe social isolation that ultimately restrict a person's quality of life?
I will be arguing that frugality is an offensive strategy for liberation. It is a radical act of lifestyle design that buys the ultimate commodity, which is structural freedom and absolute control over your own time.
And I'll be arguing that while frugality certainly has its utility, treating it as some absolute doctrine acts as a highly demanding defensive posture. It imposes significant, often unacknowledged cognitive burdens, and honestly, it risks devolving into this rigid, isolating constraint that can entirely sever a person from the social fabric.
Well, to set the baseline here, we have to instantly separate frugality from cheapness. And we don't really need to dwell on this because the distinction is simple, but it is vital.
Yeah, they get conflated all the time.
They really do. Cheapness is a scarcity-driven obsession with the lowest absolute price. It operates out of fear, it buys poor quality items that break, and ironically, it results in a higher long-term cost.
Right, the Boots theory of socioeconomic unfairness.
Exactly. Now, frugality is abundance-driven. It's the application of engineering principles to your personal finance. It's about maximizing utility and total life cycle return on investment. The core mechanism is basically this: by radically lowering your fixed overhead and eliminating waste, you build this unshakable engine for the gap between your earnings and your needs.
But that gap
isn't just money sitting in an account. That gap buys time. It creates a structural buffer that makes an individual fundamentally free and, highly resilient against any economic shock.
Right. I understand the engineering appeal of that gap. On paper, it's beautiful, but we have to look at the immense unseen friction required to actually maintain it. Frugality operates against literally every systemic incentive of modern life.
Well, modern life is designed to make you spend.
Exactly. We live in an environment perfectly optimized for the immediate. Frictionless credit, one-click purchasing, algorithmic marketing, engineered novelty. It's all everywhere. The system desperately wants you to solve every single daily friction with capital.
Because it profits off of your impatience.
Sure, but to practice extreme frugality requires you to swim against that extraordinarily powerful current every single day. That demands constant, conscious resistance. You are essentially replacing a financial cost with an executive function cost. You're imposing a heavy creativity tax on your mental bandwidth.
I don't know if I'd call it a tax.
It absolutely is. Furthermore, when applied universally, this kind of relentless optimization can easily become rigid, right? And counterproductive. It cuts deeply into your time, your health, your social capital, ultimately leaving you in an identity vacuum in a world that fundamentally requires you to signal who you are.
Okay, let's dive right into that psychological execution. Because I argue the mental bandwidth you're talking about is actually an investment. It's psychological armor.
Armor against what exactly?
Against the hedonic treadmill. Neurologically, as we consume more, our dopamine baselines just shift upward. What used to be a luxury very quickly becomes a baseline necessity.
Right. Lifestyle creep.
Yeah. You get the promotion, you buy the luxury sedan, and 6 months later, it's just the car you drive to work. You have to spend exponentially more just to feel a baseline level of normal. Frugality actively breaks that treadmill.
By just depriving yourself?
No, by utilizing stoic practices, specifically negative visualization. The frugal person consciously chooses not to acquire and actually imagines the loss of what they already have. This resets the brain's expectation baseline. It preserves the contrast effect.
Okay, but
When you live frugally, occasional treats remain genuinely magical because your dopamine receptors aren't completely blown out by constant frictionless consumption. You derive your satisfaction from internal markers of discipline rather than external consumption.
look, the hedonic treadmill is real. I'll give you that. But let's break down the reality of the so-called psychological armor. You are asking for a cognitive exhaustion that is almost impossible to sustain.
I think you're overstating the exhaustion.
Am I? In a frictionless world, consumption is the default solution. I know what anyone listening to this is thinking. They're thinking, I work 50 hours a week, I have 2 kids, I am not going to spend my Saturday sourcing a replacement heating coil for a $30 toaster.
Well, yeah, because society has trained them to throw it away.
And they are absolutely right to throw it away. The frictionless solution is a one-click replacement that arrives tomorrow. The frugal solution is researching the toaster's mechanics, diagnosing the fault, finding a part, waiting for it, and then figuring out how to install it.
Which teaches you a skill.
Now, multiply that toaster across every single aspect of your daily life. Your wardrobe, your transportation, your food prep, your entertainment. Constantly evaluating total life cycle costs and, resisting the urge to solve problems with money, it requires a staggering amount of active engagement.
Right. Active engagement.
The effort required to solve the problem of need without using money violently drains your cognitive bandwidth. You might be protecting yourself from the hedonic treadmill, sure, but you are chaining yourself to a treadmill of relentless logistical calculation.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. Isn't this like driving a manual transmission in a world of automatic cars?
How so?
Tense. It prevents the atrophy of our innate problem-solving muscles. When you mend, repair, improvise, and yes, fix that toaster, you are developing a deep, unshakable sense of self-mastery.
Self-mastery over a kitchen appliance?
You are proving to yourself on a visceral level that you are not utterly dependent on a global supply chain or a one-click purchase to simply survive in the world. That competence yields a profound, durable satisfaction that a credit card simply cannot buy.
A manual transmission is a fantastic analogy, actually, because in heavy stop-and-go traffic, driving a stick shift stops being a joyful exercise in mechanical mastery, and it becomes a brutal, agonizing cramp in your left leg.
Okay, dramatic, but go on.
The modern economy is stop-and-go traffic. It's complex, it's exhausting, and it is fast-paced. When you are already managing a demanding career, civic obligations, and a family, adding the mandate to constantly repair and financially optimize every material interaction, it's a one-way ticket to burnout. You are spending your most valuable, non-renewable resource, your focus, to save a highly renewable resource, which is money.
I'll concede that the logistical effort is real. It's there. But you are vastly overestimating it compared to the alternative.
The alternative of just living a normal life?
The alternative of financial stress. The willpower required to maintain frugality is arguably a fraction of the sheer existential panic of living paycheck to paycheck, all because you've allowed your lifestyle to inflate to match your income.
Well, obviously paycheck to paycheck is bad, but
And owning too many things carries its own massive cognitive tax, doesn't it? Cleaning, organizing, storing, insuring, worrying about theft or damage. The mental burden of excess is far heavier than the effort of intentional, disciplined restraint.
Yeah, it's easy to maintain that stoic, disciplined firewall in the isolation of your own home. But the second you step out of your front door, that internal psychology crashes into external social reality. And this is where the strategy shows its most dangerous fractures.
You mean social expectations?
Let's talk about social legibility. Human beings use consumption as a heuristic for trust, status, and alignment. It is socially legible. When you drive a certain car, or take a specific type of vacation, or wear a particular brand, you are instantly, efficiently signaling your identity to your neighbors, your colleagues, potential partners.
Right. You're buying a billboard for yourself.
But frugality produces absolutely no outward signal.
When you systematically withdraw from the language of consumption, you create an identity vacuum. Because our society relies on these signifiers to understand who people are, a radical lack of consumption doesn't read to the broader society as some brilliant strategic choice. It reads as failure.
I mean, that inverted visibility is actually a superpower. You're talking about signaling, but let's look at what is actually being signaled. The neighbor with the rotating showroom of luxury vehicles in their driveway is often the most owned by their expenses.
Owned by the bank, usually.
Exactly. They are entirely dependent on their next paycheck to maintain a shared hallucination of success. They are trapped in a performative loop. Meanwhile, the frugal person is opting out of a game that mathematically has no finish line.
But they're still playing a game.
Yes, but their wealth is invisible. It is quietly compounding in index funds rather than depreciating in a driveway. The identity vacuum you're so worried about is only a problem if you believe identity must be purchased off of a rack. Frugality forces an individual to build their identity from the ground up, through their actual behavior, their relationships, and their internal values, rather than relying on a logo to do the talking for them.
Look, building identity from internal values sounds noble in a philosophy seminar, but it completely ignores the reality of how human beings function as deeply social creatures.
We can be social without buying things.
Not in this culture. This isn't just about shallowly showing off to neighbors. It's about participating in the social fabric. There is a real-world stigma attached to this behavior. You risk becoming the person who constantly ruins group dinners by suggesting cheaper restaurants, or who alienates peers by refusing to participate in the shared cultural rituals that invariably cost money.
That's a bit of an exaggeration.
It's really not. Whether it's chipping in for a coworker's gift, attending a wedding, or joining the Friday night drinks, opting out of the language of consumption means you risk opting out of the conversation entirely. The social friction is palpable, and it can lead to severe, quiet isolation.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. I think you are conflating frugality with a miserly selfishness, which is exactly the distinction we drew at the beginning. The material notes that true frugality is compatible with profound generosity. If you waste nothing on the trivial, don't you preserve the resources to give freely to the causes and people that actually matter?
In theory, yes.
A genuinely frugal person isn't the one refusing to go to the dinner. They are the one who skipped the daily $7 latte for a month so they can joyfully and effortlessly pick up the entire check at that dinner.
But that relies on a flawless, almost robotic execution of frugality, which is incredibly rare in practice. The danger is that the neurological habit of restraint bleeds into every single interaction.
Not if you're intentional about it.
But that's hard. When your default setting for years becomes, no, that's inefficient, it requires immense emotional intelligence to know exactly when to flip that switch to yes. The risk is that the frugal person becomes so accustomed to guarding their resources that the grand generosity you're talking about remains entirely theoretical. They become so obsessed with minimizing their footprint that they forget to leave a mark.
Well, let's follow the logical conclusion of opting out at consumption, because we really need to talk about the actual tangible outcome of this restraint, the runway.
Ah, the famous runway.
When we look at the math of freedom, it alters a person's entire trajectory. If you earn a certain amount and spend 90% of it, your runway is basically non-existent. You are trapped. You are one bad quarter away from ruin.
Sure.
But if you practice intentional frugality, say engineering your life to live on 50% of your income, every single year you work funds a full year of complete structural freedom in the future. I want to emphasize how this changes a person's psychological risk profile in the workplace.
It gives them leverage.
Massive leverage. When you have 5 years of living expenses banked, a passive-aggressive boss isn't an existential threat anymore. They are a mild annoyance. You have a massive margin of safety. It dramatically lowers the stakes for taking big risks. If you want to start a company or switch to a more meaningful but lower-paying career or leave a toxic situation, you have the structural runway to do so. Frugality isn't just a budgeting tool. It is the fundamental precondition for absolute autonomy.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that it's an absolute guarantee of freedom.
How is it not? The math works.
The arithmetic is unassailable, I will grant you that. But human lives are not executed on spreadsheets. Let me tell you why. Extreme frugality easily morphs from a floor that catches you into a rigid ceiling that suppresses your life.
I completely disagree with that.
Let's look at the mechanism of building that runway. You are storing massive amounts of potential energy, right? Your wealth and your saved time. But the behavioral discipline required to build that stockpile often destroys the kinetic mechanism required to actually use it.
I don't follow. The entire premise of having a margin of safety is that it opens up possibilities. How does it suppress them?
Because if a person trains their brain for decades to view absolutely every expenditure through the lens of total life cycle optimization and ROI, they sacrifice the spontaneous, unoptimized experiences that make having a runway worth it in the first place.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Right? You store all this potential energy, but you lose the ability to convert it into kinetic energy. You reach financial independence, you have your runway, but your capacity for unstructured joy, for spontaneous travel, or for unapologetic indulgence has completely atrophied. If you spend your entire life obsessively minimizing the drag coefficient, you might build a long runway, but you've forgotten how to actually take off.
That is clever, but I think your definition of taking off is still bound by the exact consumerist mindset we are trying to escape. Taking off doesn't require a sudden, jarring pivot to hyper-consumerism.
It requires spending money, though.
The person who has spent decades building that runway hasn't forgotten how to experience joy. They have simply decoupled their flourishing from their spending. When they do take off, it doesn't have to look like chartering a yacht. It might look like taking a 2-year sabbatical to write a book, or volunteering full-time, or, deeply engaging in a complex, low-cost hobby.
But those are still... Frugality is a direct challenge to the deeply ingrained premise that more is better. The psychological evidence that acquiring more things produces more satisfaction is remarkably weak once you pass a basic threshold of security. By stepping away from that illusion, the frugal person isn't restricting their life, they are radically liberating their attention. I agree that the link between endless consumption and happiness is a myth. Absolutely. But we cannot deny that money is the primary tool for interacting with the physical and social world. When you place a highly restrictive ideological filter on how that tool is used, you inherently limit your interactions with the world.
You filter them. You don't necessarily limit them.
You limit them. Frugality requires the courage to be consistently misunderstood by society. And that courage is exhausting. Yes, it is a daily practice of choosing sovereignty over compliance, but it's also a practice of constantly being on the defensive against the culture you live in. That level of hypervigilance is precisely why frugality cannot be treated as an unquestionable absolute. It requires a toll that not everyone can or should pay.
It is a vigilance, I won't deny that, but it's a vigilance directed squarely toward self-knowledge. Spending is very often a way of perpetually deferring the hard question of what you actually want your life to be. You just buy the next thing on the script. By tracking resources and ensuring they reflect actual internal priorities, the frugal person attains a kind of wisdom about the material dimensions of life that is incredibly rare.
And I maintain that while that wisdom is valuable, it is purchased at the cost of immense cognitive labor and the very real threat of social alienation. The balance is extraordinarily delicate. Tipping into deprivation is far easier than maintaining this perfectly calibrated, stoic equilibrium you're describing.
Well, as we draw this debate to a close, I want to crystallize my position. Frugality, when properly deployed as an engineering principle rather than a fear response, is an indispensable engine for personal sovereignty. By intentionally stepping off the hedonic treadmill and refusing to outsource your identity to consumer goods, you purchase the ultimate luxury, the freedom to govern your own time. It is a radical, offensive strategy for building the structural runway necessary to live a life aligned with internal values, completely insulated from manufactured desires.
And my position remains that while frugality is undeniably a powerful tool, it must be approached with extreme caution.
The cognitive taxes of constantly swimming against the current of modern convenience, the very real potential for an identity vacuum that isolates you from your peers, and the risk of slipping into rigid deprivation mean that frugality is not a panacea. It cannot be an unquestioned absolute. It must be carefully balanced with the reality of living in a complex, deeply interconnected economy where your time, your social capital, and your mental bandwidth are also finite, precious resources.
I think we have found some solid ground to converge on today, though. We both absolutely agree that cheapness, the scarcity-driven obsession with price over total value, is a deeply flawed and ultimately costly mindset.
Oh, 100%. And I know neither of us is defending mindless hyper-consumerism or the illusion that a higher credit card bill equates to a happier life.
Exactly. True value requires deep, unflinching intentionality. Whether you are optimizing for maximum financial runway, as I suggest, or optimizing for social participation and cognitive ease, as you warn about, the core requirement is that you are making deliberate, conscious choices.
Right, you cannot simply default to the culture's expectations.
Evaluating our own baselines of consumption can illuminate our underlying values in ways few other exercises really can. When you audit your own runway, you uncover exactly what hidden taxes you might be paying, whether they're financial, cognitive, or social.
Because once you truly understand the mechanisms at play, like how the hedonic treadmill manipulates your baseline and how the creativity tax drains your energy, you are fundamentally better equipped to navigate those choices. I think there's so much more to explore in the material regarding how these forces shape our daily decisions.
So, we return to where we began. You look out at the highly legible, visible skyline of wealth, all the luxury, the cars, the brands gleaming in the sun, and you have to ask yourself, is that the ultimate expression of success? Or is the true architecture of freedom something entirely invisible, silently compounding beneath the surface, affording you the power to walk away whenever you choose? We leave it to you to determine where the line between liberation and deprivation truly lies.